right now I'd like to introduce our speakers. So Tresna and Brett have been working together over the past 5 years, doing research and development inside New Zealand businesses to find ways of applying the latest knowledge in the human sciences to real-world workplace settings. This led to the development of a unique process-based methodology that they are now using to help people learn how to engage with, and more importantly, practice the mental, emotional, and behavioral skills that drive our capability to be agile human beings. And in our case, as agile practitioners, to go beyond simply doing the agile practices. So please welcome Tresna and Brett.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that very warm introduction and for the claps that we can see in the background, whether they're either emojis or real human claps. Either is absolutely acceptable. So thank you.
And in the chats too.
And in the chats, that's awesome.
Clap.
So look, just to put a little more colour on the palette. That Beth's just created for us, just a little bit of background on Tresna and myself and the work that we've been doing, and then we'll give you a quick idea as to what we're going to be doing in this session this afternoon. So my background is in the business world, so consulting, management consulting, and a lot of work in the leadership development area for pretty much all of my career. Tresna is a psychologist. She has a PhD in psychology and leadership, and specialises in a particular, or has a specialism particularly in the area of behavioural science. And we decided 5 years ago that there was a lot of new thinking, a lot of research, a lot of insights that were beginning to emerge from the human sciences that had the potential to play a massive role in the workplace. So we've been working together, as Beth alluded to, over the last 5 years, just really trying to find a kind of a landing place for where that human science could fit. And as a result of that, it enabled us to develop a methodology that we're going to begin to kind of explore what that looks like and how it works with you this evening. The research process that we went through also led us to establish the Institute for Social Sustainability, and that's where Tresna and I both live and work. And really the focus of the Institute is on the research and development and education across different human ecosystems. So, we think, to us, Agile is a human ecosystem. And it's, there's a lot of similar needs within that ecosystem. There are very different needs, but a lot of similar ones. What we're seeing across these different ecosystems that we work with is that there's a very consistent need, and that is, how do we sustainably adapt to change and to complexity? And that's something that, as Agile practitioners, is a narrative that you're only too familiar with. And the COVID-19 obviously has sort of magnified this challenge globally and here in New Zealand. And I don't know if anyone participated last week in the Vision Week New Zealand, where there were a lot of pretty smart people coming together to talk about the future of New Zealand, and the sort of the underlying narrative in that. And it's also something that Tresna and I have seen in the work we've been doing recently, or since the beginning of COVID-19, is how do we not go back to what we had? How do we not revert to type as we start coming out of COVID-19, that we leave behind the things that weren't helping us as a society or as human beings, as individuals, in our workplace practices, in our personal lives, in our family ecosystems? And how do we develop new ways of being, new behavior, new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving that are more sustainable as we grow as a species? So that's the work that Tresna and I have been setting out to do. So there's a long kind of history behind all of this, and that's very much the work that we've been doing is very much grounded in the latest science. So we've tested it and continue to test it and seek input from other people that are working in this field around the world. Recently we teamed up, at the beginning of this year, we teamed up with Tech Futures Lab, who many of you will know here in Auckland, with Francis Valentine. And really, at a broad level, the idea was an opportunity we both saw it to bring together the work that they've been doing and continue to do in technology and the future of work, and the work that we've been doing in the human sciences, and bring them together. So we developed a program, it's an NZQA program that runs under the name of Organisational Agility. We're running that at the moment. It's an online program, runs for 14 weeks. It's what's called a micro-credential, which essentially is an NZQA approved education program that's designed to kind of meet very specific industry needs as a standalone course. And the program that we're running at the moment earns people 15 credits. So it's nice to have a New Zealand oriented program that's, sort of moving into this space. We will be running the Organisational Agility program specifically for Agile practitioners towards the beginning of September. We'll be beginning that. We will be able to send you more details. We're just currently making some final adjustments to the website in terms of the dates and the program profile, and so we'll be able to let you know exactly when that is ready for you to look at. So that's going to be a fantastic step ahead for us to be able to work with Agile practitioners and kind of help you move to that next level of evolution in terms of your own practices. So what we're going to do tonight is we've got a short video that we're going to play you, and we created that video just for this evening. The reason being is that one of the things that we've realized in the work that we've been doing is that there is a real sense of precision and accuracy that's needed when you're talking about human beings, mindset, human behavior. So we are very careful about making sure that when we describe what we do it in a very precise way. So, and we are finding that by doing that by video enables us to do that. So we're going to play you a video. It's I think about 8 minutes long, eight or 9 minutes long. And that will give you a really good sense of how we see the world that we work in and the agile world that you work in actually symbiotically coming together and in a way that I suspect you may not have seen before or thought of before. So we're going to play that video, and then afterwards we're going to give you a little exercise to do. We're going to send you into some breakout rooms and we're going to get you to do an exercise where you can start to draw your own connections between the work that we're doing and your day-to-day experiences. So, and then we're going to have a discussion around that. We'll get you, after the breakout rooms, we'll get you to come back together and we'll all have a chat and just see if we can draw some insights from that. So that's how the session's going to go, if that all makes sense. I will now throw over to Tresna.
So I'm going to bring up this video. It takes approximately 10 minutes to watch. After that, we're going to just come back. I'll bring up a slide after this that we're going to talk to first as a kind of primer into the exercises that we're going to go into. So without further ado, let me know if this doesn't work for some reason.
Kia ora and welcome to this video exploring organisational agility. My name is Dr. Tresna Hunt and I'm co-director of the Institute for Social Sustainability. This video has been designed to help you to understand the relationship between agile business practices and adaptive agile mindsets in the context of the fourth industrial revolution. You will all be familiar with the changing tide of business practice away from traditional ways of doing things toward being agile and adaptive as we move into the fourth industrial revolution. Right now, we could argue that we're in a transition or hybrid phase, which is being put under the spotlight by COVID-19, and the need is increasingly urgent for organisations to learn to respond to complexity, volatility, and change. We're seeing the laying of a fertile ground for agile business practice. However, while some businesses might be agile, many more are currently still operating under traditional or hybrid structures. But even businesses who claim to be agile may still not fully understand what agile and adaptive mindsets are and how they contribute to sustainably adaptive organisations. There's a migration away from command and control or waterfall cultures where information flows from the top down and strategic problem solving lies in the hands of a few key people. The fourth industrial revolution has brought with it so much more information that problem-solving capability now needs to exist across an entire organisation, so that cross-functional teams can work together in innovative ways to support the rapid adaptation of the But a few key decision makers no longer have the ability to solve on their own. The hidden challenge is that complex problem solving lies at the very heart of open and adaptive cultures, yet many of us continue to have a traditional top-down problem solving mindset that is no longer effective in the complex and volatile information era we've moved to, and few people recognise that this is actually the key challenge for businesses today. Empowering people across the organisational system to become high-quality, complex problem solvers means changing some of our deep assumptions about what high-quality leadership looks like. An upgraded view of leadership in the fourth industrial era is one in which leaders support the development of complex problem-solving capability and create the conditions for people to engage in high-quality problem-solving activities that lead to rapid adaptation and sustainable innovation. The World Economic Forum stipulates that today's leaders need to be able to create more action-based learning models, understand the expanded role of business in society, and support lifelong learning. 5 years of our own research and development in the New Zealand business context has validated these ideas, and this is a leadership shift that we're supporting people to make. The leadership and culture of contemporary organisations can only be built around the mindsets of individuals within the organisation. Traditional businesses have been based on rules-driven mindsets that create stable status quo structures within which people are expected to operate. These rules are subtly worked to constrain the emotions, thinking and behaviours of individuals within businesses, as those people are conditioned and rewarded for staying within the rules. Rule following, whilst efficient in terms of conventional business practices, is now serving to shut down complex problem solving, which demands high levels of individual emotional thinking and behavioural flexibility. The innovation and adaptation challenges therefore is to liberate people in the workplace by transitioning them to adaptive-driven mindsets. This means that we have a major opportunity to upskill people so that they can engage with their own innovation potential and with others in team contexts. We therefore suggest that truly adaptive and agile businesses must rest on the foundations of truly adaptive and agile mindsets. Businesses that adopt agile practices without understanding this deeper dynamic need risk being stranded in hybrid business models that will ultimately limit their true potential. Our perspective is that agile mindsets need to exist across the organisation, and that this then drives agile leadership, agile cultures, and ultimately genuine agile businesses. Traditional rules-driven organisations have the following qualities, many of which we're sure you will be only too familiar with. Short-term reward focused, fear avoidance driven, rules governed, emotionally rigid, habitual, enable unconscious bias, and inhibit adaptability. In contrast, adaptive-driven mindsets have the following qualities: long-term reward focused, fear avoidance aware, principles governed, emotionally flexible, creative, inhibit unconscious bias, and enable adaptability. Our research tells us that for most people, a learning bridge needs to be crossed in order to transition to a truly adaptive-driven mindset. We've designed this bridge with the aim of walking people over to an adaptive mindset and moving them squarely into the fourth industrial era. Once they've crossed the bridge, they will see and experience the world through an agile lens. We've learned that trying to upskill people within the current paradigm simply adds more noise and stress to people. It just doesn't work. There's a relearning that needs to take place that rewires us out of a traditional mindset into a contemporary adaptive mindset. The rewiring focuses on teaching people the skills of emotional thinking and behavioural flexibility that enable complex problem solving. We also teach people how to translate the learning into real world capabilities and about how individual complex problem solving transforms leadership practices and cultures to drive genuine agile businesses. And this is how we define the three different yet interconnected types of flexibility needed to solve complex problems well. Emotional flexibility is the ability to identify and work with difficult emotions. Thinking flexibility is the ability to use flexible perspective taking to landscape complex problems. Behavioural flexibility is the ability to move ideas into action in order to drive value-added products and services across different contexts. Complex problem solving is therefore the ability to draw on these skills to navigate problem landscapes with clarity, awareness and precision. Our research tells us that adaptive mindsets lay the foundations for agile businesses by creating the right leadership and cultural conditions. As you can see in the illustration, the adaptive mindsets at the bottom of flexibility and emotion, thought and behaviour lay the foundations for contextual leaders who have facilitative, inclusive, open and inspired actions and behaviours, and then who in turn lay the foundations for innovative cultures that are infused with the virtues of conscious cooperation, mutual social influence, creativity and truth-seeking. And finally, these innovative cultures drive agile businesses that are adaptive, productive, sustainable and connected. We predict that adaptive mindsets are...
Can I just check in with everyone, because there's been some challenges hearing the video, I'm hearing in the chats. Can you hear me at the moment? Yep. Are we struggling with this? Working fine for me. Do you guys want me to keep going? Because we can stop if it's not working and we can adapt. Working for me. Saying you want us to keep going? Can you? Yep, keep going. Yeah. Yep. Working fine. Yeah, it's good. You want to keep going?
Yep. It was a bit quiet at the beginning, but it works now.
Okay. Looks like you want us to keep going, so we'll keep going. Just to check in.
Thanks.
Oh, hang on.
Me that there are a small percentage of people who are likely to be truly agile in emotion, thought and action in the workplace. Our goal is to shift people to the right so that we have a population who knows how to solve complex problems well and therefore understands how to adapt to changing environments over time. This capability sits at the heart of our ability as a species to adapt to change and therefore is important not only for organisations but also for all of our social ecosystems. One way to understand what these skills look like is to ask yourself the following questions. Do you have personal strategies for identifying and working with difficult emotions? If so, what are they? Do you know how to use flexible perspective taking to landscape complex problems? If so, how? Do you have personal strategies for moving ideas into action in order to drive value-added products and services across different contexts? If so, what are they? Most people will not have a clear answer to these questions because they've not yet learned how to solve complex problems in a sustainable way. However, some people are naturally adaptive in their abilities and will use these skills unconsciously. A problem with this unconscious learning is that because it's unconscious, it cannot be easily transferred as knowledge and skills to others. And so leaders are limited in their ability to create adaptive cultures, even if they have an adaptive mindset themselves. So we've figured out how to extract this capability from the skilled population and teach it to everyone. Okay, that's the end of this video exploring the relationship between agile practices and agile and adaptive mindsets. Feel free to touch base at any stage if you want to talk about this topic any further with us. Ka kite anō, see you soon.
Sorry, I'm having problems.
There we go.
Okay, so we've got some questions coming in the chats, which is awesome.
Trisna, did you want to talk to this, or Kainat, did you want to?
Kind of, you were quite interested in this quote. Did you want to say anything about this?
So I actually just wanted to open the conversation around, there are lots of, so what Tresna and Brett have just presented in the 9-minute video has been quite a nice linear, and it's actually reflected in the question Jim's just asked, that the development of an adaptive mindset is actually just a starting point of taking us to an agile business. And there's 2 more steps within it around building leadership, which thinks like that, plus building a culture, and that enables us to drive to the agile business. And for professionals who are in the agile space, I saw a lot of reflection and a lot of mapping between building those practices to some of the practices we see in practice day to day. And this quote really resonated with me, which I wanted to share with the group, around how adaptive mindsets and agile practices in real life actually have a lot of backing towards each other. It is the adaptive mindsets that you see behind, that is set behind the practices of Scrum or Kanban, or thinking in incremental development, or having an adaptive business approach, or thinking about your portfolios and building lean practices around it. All of those principles that we see on a day-to-day basis actually have the thinking and the psychology of adaptive mindsets behind it. And I'll let you all reflect on this quote for a second, and then I'll read it out, and we can maybe have a small discussion around it. So we've got a couple of minutes now to have a read of it. We good?
It's such a great quote, Kainat.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's the one that resonates the most with what we've just shown around going from rules driven to adaptive driven, and the clear bridge that we have between it, which purely starts with your adaptive mindsets. We're not even in the world of software, we're not solving technical problems. We're building human experiences. We're solving complex human behavioral problems. We want systems and everything that we work on today to be very natural to the human experience. And human beings are a complex being. So it's equipping us as Agile is a set of practices that allows us to equip us to deal with the creativity, the complexity of human behavior that comes with using tools. You know, at the end of the day, our customer is there, and now there's this whole technology piece between us, and it's unpacking that complexity that helps us to do that. And what we've just spoken about in the video around adaptive mindsets is a very clear set of frameworks around, well, maybe they're not frameworks. Agile practices are actually bringing the frameworks in, but the thinking behind the adaptive mindsets is actually allowing us to build that flexibility in our thinking, in our emotions, in our behavior, and getting us to think about those 3 aspects of how we, within the Agile world, behave today, and why we expect that every business needs to become an Agile business.
I'd also just like to add that last sentence on that quote is the one that's most important to me, because unleashing collective creativity, there's so many forces and processes involved in unleashing collective creativity. And how do you go about doing that, especially if there's a movement away from command and control, which really doesn't understand collective creativity? So you've got the kind of like movement and traditions happening at the same time as trying to discover what this actually means. And the heart of creativity is actually solving problems through, blending, breaking things, together, smashing things together, creating new possibilities and innovations. And that is actually a problem-solving activity. And problem solving goes our emotions go hand in hand with problem solving in ways that people don't actually understand. So the emotional, they're all important, but the emotional aspect of it is particularly important.
Yeah.
Okay, so does anyone want to mention anything or say anything before we move on, just on the basis of that video and that quote? No? Okay.
I've got a question from Jim.
Okay, let's go. Chat. Jim, where are you? Does an adaptive mindset of individuals in a company lead to an adaptive enterprise? Absolutely. I presume there are some processes that lead to adaptive enterprises as an emergent property of individuals. Yeah, so that's basically the essence is if you have people who have an adaptive mindset, then they come together and work in teams in a very different way, in a conscious way. So we talk about conscious cooperation, mutual social influence. So these are different ways that you come together, and it's the joining up of these conscious problem solving and aware processes that actually create the enterprise, the open and agile enterprise. It's pretty much the only way that it can happen. And if you want that to have if you want to have a truly agile business, then it's not enough to have your top tier leaders understand how to do agile, because if they don't have the capacity to create the conditions and the context for other people to operate in that way, it's not gonna happen. And you still got that kind of hybrid approach trying to happen. Does he that mindset? Parasitism. I don't know that framework. Jim, just an answer to your question around Snowdens Framework. I'll have to write it down and go and have a look. Luke, does the adaptive mindset solving complex human problems build on empiricism? Inspect. I think it's the same one. Thanks, Luke. Okay.
So I can answer that one. Yes, Jim, it does. So the Kniffen model is around the type of problem you're solving. So as soon as you get to a complex problem, the approach needs to be completely different. And yes, adaptive mindset is definitely getting into the realm of looking at complex human problems and moving to, and as the word would suggest, an inspect and adapt model that we on a day-to-day basis see in any business that is adopting any agile practices. We tend to put these frameworks in place, whether it be Scrum, whether it be Kanban, whether it be a mix of the two, whether it be even remotely resembling to any of those, and it's a completely hybrid approach that they've created themselves. It is the whole breaking down the work into smaller chunks and building inspect and adapt practices or ceremonies or events or meetings that are there within that cycle to make sure we're doing that as we go along the delivery path. And that naturally will help you look at a complex problem. Even if it's not that complex problem, just the fact that you're breaking it down into smaller chunks is going to allow you to get in the mind of saying that you're breaking down a big chunk of work into.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of that framework, but if it allows people to discern the environment, sort it out into different variables and see the landscape of the problem, then it's definitely aligned, because that's what we do. We help people to sort of move around in a problem-solving landscape rather than it just being one chunk of a problem, so that it allows you to kind of navigate your way through it with more precision and accuracy and at a much higher quality.
Just the question, there's a question, Sarah's popped a question there about, do we talk about design thinking in relation to the creative problem solving? We don't, well, let me rephrase that. Design thinking, agile processes and practices, many of these disciplines or approaches, it can be applied to, solving complex problems. What we've realized in the approach that we've built is that often something like design thinking, for example, which is a really valuable process, no doubt about it, often it can sit without, or people adopt it without the full context in which it sits. And what I mean by that is that, you can go into an organization or go into any situation and apply the principles of design thinking. But if we're not really aware of the systemic forces and the systemic reality of that situation, and if we're not aware of, for example, the social system in which that situation sits, then often what seems to happen is that the principles and the logic of it seems fine, but the complexity of the environment in which you're working in means that it's difficult to make it as effective as it could be a lot of the time. So we're very conscious of, and so the other thing about that is that, often with things like design thinking or other approaches, what they don't do is drill down into the underlying understanding and the methodology around human behavior. So helping people to actually really get down to that very individual level of understanding their stories that drive their behavior, the way they think, the connection between the stories, the way they think, the way they behave, the way they feel. Unless we have a working understanding and start to develop an understanding of that, then it becomes very difficult to actually get sustainable and genuine behavior change. So, you know, the model that we've developed works across that, starting at an individual level, because you see this, and we see this, and have seen it, you know, constantly, that it's very easy to kind of overlay onto an organization a set of principles or practices or systems, and expect them to start to work. But there's a massive flaw in that thinking, because you actually have to get right down to an individual and help them understand at that very human level how to make that work, how they can engage with that, and how they can practice that in the order to develop a more agile and a more flexible and a more adaptive mindset. Then you scale it to the next, to the relational level. So it's all very well and good if I personally can think in a very agile way, in a very flexible and a very adaptive way, but I'm working with people who are not like that. So how do I then build a relationship with them in a way that can move them towards being more agile and flexible and adaptive? Then you scale it up again and say, well, how do you put that across an entire organization? Right? So there's a really clear process and a structure to be able to get an organization to move in this direction. So that's the specificity that we're, you know, really zoning in on in terms of how you do that, because it's easy to say these things, as you well know. Getting it to actually work is not as easy.
Okay, do you want to just, we can come back and talk at the end, but we're just going to move along and do this exercise where you guys can break away and have a look at this exercise that we've got. And we're going to go off into breakout groups. I want you to think about the prevalent agile practices that you see at your workplace, and then think about how they help you to build the mindset skills below. So the emotional flexibility, the thinking flexibility, and the behavioral flexibility. So see if you can map on these skill sets into your agile practice. Go into your breakout rooms, have a bit of a chat, and then we can come back and keep talking. Awesome. So there's some really great conversations going on there, and maybe we just have a quick sort of few comments from people about the relationship they saw between agile and emotional and behavioural and thinking flexibility, just to kind of get us further into that conversation again.
You
So
can take your mute off and talk about these rather than put them into the chat room.
Yeah.
Hello, I'll start off. So a couple of things came up in our discussion. One was the retrospective, and that was a really good example. I won't go through exactly what we discussed. I think it's probably pretty clear to most people when you think about what happens in a retrospective, those three things about how they apply. There was another example with respect to the way the organisation was structured. And we had a final example there from myself about an individual, a product owner who's making decisions about ROI. And what was interesting is that when we look at those three things at team level, at an individual level, as well as the way you structure the organisation, those three things seem to make sense: the emotional flexibility, the thinking flexibility, and the behavioural flexibility. Was pretty easy to identify characteristics that made sense as enablers for those outcomes.
Yeah, great, awesome.
Great insight.
Yeah,
really well articulated.
Really, yeah, nice.
And I think just building on that, Morgan. So herein lies, you know, the key to all of this is that, you know, when we separate that out, you know, when we separate out emotional flexibility, thinking flexibility, behavioral flexibility, you know, cognitively we all kind of get that, kind of like get that. The reality is that when we as individuals, human beings, want to learn to become more adaptive and agile, we actually have to understand that process in ourselves, right? So the connections between the way we think, our emotions, and our behavior. Right, so that's when it starts the critical element that becomes, you know, how do I engage with this, and how do I practice this day to day, moment to moment, to take it out of just being a cognitive idea into a very real, felt experience.
And I think it's not only that, we had a conversation about coming together as a team. So do people come together as a team? Do some people in that context slightly shut down or shut down quite a bit? You know, we were talking about going off as an individual. People might be fine and they might, you know, open up and come up with ideas, and then you get this kind of team dynamic that can happen, and it's around how do you as a group, and even if it's cross-functional teams coming together, then you've got these different cultural aspects to it. So how do you navigate those kind of deeper forces that are within people around the desire to avoid, the fear of this, whatever, and you know, and also the knowledge or the understanding of how do you take an idea and step it through into value added, you know, like how do you do that in a way that you feel, you know, okay within yourself to do that and experiment and try within a team context, and what sort of culture is within that context that supports everyone being able to work with knowledge, moving it through into outcomes in a way that's really fluid, that's, you know, the obstacles, the human aspects, the obstacles are kind of removed, those constraints are removed. So how do you do that in a kind of agile environment?
I know we've had issues with that, and I think two things that have helped us a lot is having trust in the rest of the people of the team, and also having emotional vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely.
One technique we found useful that's come from a colleague who was a paramedic was the idea that you can check out of a meeting if you don't feel that you're not in the right mental place to be in that meeting and contribute in a positive way. And so one of the things he had was the acronym HALT: hungry, angry, late, tired. And the fact that it's okay to check out and you don't have to explain why, it just means that you're not going to be constructive in that space because of a reason. And then you can check back in.
Nice.
And encouraging people not to be in the room if they can't actually engage and contribute was very powerful.
Yeah, nice.
Oh, okay.
Go Wellington. No, you're on. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. The one way that I've also sort of found working is the leadership aspect. If you run this whole transformation from the top going down, and I've tried to use bubbles, and starting with the leadership as a bubble, walking the talk, using the leadership shadows to get people practicalizing this whole thing and becoming comfortable with the whole transformation journey. I've seen people becoming more comfortable, and those that are doubting, realizing that there's total buy-in from the leadership, they tend to start asking the right questions and becoming comfortable that they can follow. And from the leadership, you start getting more managers getting involved as coaches and transmitting the right signals to the teams. So I think from a transformation point of view, if you get the leadership buy-in faster and early, the other teams as bubbles tend to follow nicely, on condition that you've got the necessary support systems and your retrospectives are also used to kind of gauge the energy and tap into the questions that people may be having. And if people are doing the coaching, they address all the queries or impediments that people may be having. But at the end of the day, I think that working on people's minds is probably the best approach, because organizations don't transform, it's people who transform, right? So if you focus on people, the chances of you succeeding are much higher than, you know, making this a project or targeting the events and ticking the boxes. So this is what was exciting for me about this whole discussion.
Awesome.
You've hit the nail on the head, Wellington. I mean, it's you know, an organization is nothing more than a series of individuals, period, end of story. That's where it has to start, and that's where organizations often struggle. That's the, you know, the theory of it is great, but how do you do what you're saying needs to be done? This is the work that we're beginning to do. So
I mean, I had a guy in my group now when we did the breakout who was saying he's trying to transform, but he's struggling because some of the managers are not buying into the process. And I was saying to him, you know, have you had a conversation with the big boss, whether it's a GM or CEO? Have you at least managed to have a conversation without using the word agile? Because as you know, people don't like agile. People like what agile does, right? So are you able to have an outcomes-driven conversation with the head of the organization to try and understand what are the pain points that the organization is facing? What I've done previously is to actually get people doing what agile mindsets are all about as a culture, and sometimes go back to them and say, by the way, what you're doing is actually agile, and people realize, oh, okay, now I see it's practical.
Yeah.
Because you have a bunch of people, they'll go on a 2-day course, they come and lecture you on agile, tick all the boxes like a religion, and then people get confused and they think it doesn't work. So
yeah, you make some
I've shied away from the whole.
You make some really good points there, Wellington. Completely agree with you. It's just all in the human behavior. And there's also a really good question here from Graz. Is it Graz? I don't know if I'm saying that right. What problem solving or decision making framework would you recommend? Well, we've got our own problem solving framework that we've designed. So I don't have a specific recommendation. We designed it over 5 years. So essentially we went into New Zealand businesses and just picked up some work and helped them to solve problems. And then we took the science and designed our program backwards from an end user perspective. So using the language that they understood and using the science at the same time. And we developed a framework where we help people to map out the landscape of complex problems and identify these different places within that landscape that they can operate, so that they can understand when they're sitting inside a problem, when they're out, what being outside the problem might look like, and how to actually transition themselves from inside the problem to outside the problem, right down from that behavioral level, but right down underneath those into that really deeply hidden stories or emotional level, where actually solving the problem might require a lot of discomfort, but understanding with real precision about how they're moving, why they're moving, and what's involved, and knowing how to stack up that kind of their psychology in a way, their motivational aspects of their psychology, stack it up to help them move outside of the problem, them and their teams. So that's yeah, I mean, we can talk to you more about that sometime if you're interested. But that framework essentially was built out of the fact that we couldn't find a framework that did the job that we needed it to do, and that we were hearing that people needed when we were going in and consulting. So I've sort of answered your question.
I mean, in a way, what we're doing is teaching people to be problem solvers themselves. Because everyone, I mean, there are lots of models around, and as is always the case with models and theories and processes, they work for some, they don't work for others. So, we realize that more than anything right now, at a global level, at a meta level, given the massive degree of change people are going through, COVID-19 especially, but even outside of that, complexity just gets more and more overwhelming. The noise, in people's lives get more and more overwhelming. So the idea of having a theoretical model to work through that is one thing. Actually learning as an individual, how do I move through that, and how do I solve the problems that I'm facing into in my life, personal problems, work-related problems, small problems, large problems. So that's what we're doing, is setting up an individual to be able to solve problems themselves. And in some cases, it underpins another problem-solving model.
And it sits, I mean, I think the one thing that we got frustrated with was that there was no scale. So we needed a framework where we could teach individuals how to engage flexibly in problem solving. But then how do you, as a team, engage in that process of flexible problem solving? And then how do you cross-functionally, and then as an entire organization? So that scale piece, so you can go to the science and have a look at the research, and it might focus on the individual, but to actually take it right through all the different levels, and you can apply the same principles and the same framework at different levels was the challenge that we were tasked with, and that's what we pursued. Any other comments that you want to make, or questions that you have? Like we were talking about relating Agile to flexibility. So if there's any comments you wanted to make about other relationships you saw there, or if you just want to ask questions and make some observations and comments.
Another interesting one in the chat box, actually, from Gratz.
Self-awareness and awareness of others. I think it's a starting point for emotional.
Yeah, what I meant is that we were talking about, especially when we were talking about emotional agility, is that the self-awareness is the starting point. And I wondered and awareness of others, what are your thoughts how that is needed for the agility, but probably more interestingly for problem solving.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's such a great question, because awareness, when you start to have awareness, then you start to discern the world in a different way that you didn't have access to before. So, you know, if we don't have awareness and we come across problems and we're just responding and reacting, and we have all our kind of unconscious biases and our mental shortcuts that we take. So awareness helps us to lift us up. And then with awareness, we start to see the world, we can discern my emotions and my thinking, and there's space in between how I'm behaving and how I'm responding. So that awareness piece is noticing the world differently, and the relationships and processes between things in the world, and my place in those processes. How do I drive these outcomes? How does my emotion, you know, relate to the way that I'm thinking, or vice versa, or these actions that are driving these outcomes? And when I get together with other people, we're all doing that. How are we doing that as a collective to move this information through and transform it into something innovative through our psychology? Does that make sense? Yeah, nodding head. Any more questions around that? Yeah.
I just build on that one a bit, Trez. I think this is why we have this this definition of behavioural flexibility about you know, moving ideas into action and driving value-added products and services, which that's obvious to you, but you know, the last part of that is across different contexts, and that's where if we've got rigid models to work with, they can become quite problematic, because of course, and again, most of you will have experienced this, there'll be certain contexts in which you're working where you're comfortable, right? Certain types of people, certain subject matters, where you're able to, you know, drive outcomes because you're comfortable in that environment, or you're used to that environment. But all of a sudden, in a different context, for example, moving into a leadership or an executive team within an organisation, who perhaps don't understand Agile, or don't want to understand Agile, or see Agile as like it for the wrong reasons, then often it's really difficult in that context, for example, to actually, you know, push ideas through and drive them through to, you know, an outcome that you want. So this is why the contextualization of human behavior is so critical, because again, particularly in the roles you're in, where you are often dealing with inside really different contexts in terms of the environment, the workplace, but then individual pockets of people within that organization, the different contexts, being able to migrate between them and still deliver the outcomes that you want, that's where you need really deep-seated, you know, emotional, behavioral and thinking flexibility.
Any other observations about the relationship between this stuff and Agile, or any other questions or observations in general?
Just from me too, I think a good trick with, I do appreciate with facilitation, it's good to drive self-awareness and stuff, but sometimes it's good to let the room speak as well, and it's always a challenge getting the quiet ones in the room, but I do notice sometimes it's best for the facilitators to sometimes be the observer or drive, instead of, you know, filling up noise in the room, but just letting others embrace those comfortable silences and getting them to feel more comfortable to speak up.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And part of that's the facilitators understanding what they're doing, right? And why they're doing it, understanding that bigger picture about, you know, the human psychology of the group, what happens in group context. It's a really good point. Have you encountered situations where there are senior people who find agility does match with their mindset or values?
Or doesn't match?
Is it does or doesn't? Sorry, does not. Oh, yeah.
Oh, my bad, does not.
Yeah, this is it's a really interesting question, Guy. Absolutely is the answer. One of the things we've observed is that in a hierarchical organisation, you get reinforced for sort of sometimes and often you're actually reinforced for having a more rigid mindset as you move up. because, you know, there's certain models that people take on board and they think that's the way that we do it. This is how you do leadership. Or so their identity can become really stuck to ways of doing that really limit their behavioural flexibility. And so what happens is that they get rewarded for, you know, these higher levels of movement up the hierarchy, and taking risks becomes really problematic for them because their position, or, you know, their perceived position can be under threat. And so, you know, rewarding innovation, rewarding risk-taking, rewarding vulnerability as you move up those leadership positions doesn't actually happen for the most part. And that's what needs to happen. We need to find people who are able to move flexibly and fluidly, who can ask the right questions, who can facilitate, and who get out there and say, hey, you know, have you tried that? Have you tried, you know, great, awesome, can see that, rather than actually shutting down, instead of slowly taking on that top-down mentality, which then, you know, agility then threatens. Does that make, am I making sense there?
Yeah, that's sort of where I'm going.
Yeah.
I mean, I've encountered people who intellectually understand the advantages of being agile, how that will make a better product and everything else, but they find that the agile process and the lack of individual control and lone reward create significant stress for them.
Yes.
And they can't actually stop that.
That's right. Well, that's because
rooted.
we talk about the rigidity, we talk about trials, repeat trials. So in life, we habits form, so we go through processes of being reinforced. And if you're reinforced enough times over a long enough period of time, then neurologically you become locked into that habit. And that is tending to happen in under those command and control hierarchical structures. And unlocking that once you're an adult, you have to go through a rewiring process. Now, going through a rewiring process in an organisation where you have to be presentation managing yourself as a particular type of leader isn't going to happen.
Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah. So one of the challenges we have with agility is that, you know, you guys are naturally agile and you're attracted to agile, so you probably operate in that way to some degree. Not everyone's like that. We have these existing organisations are still in that kind of sort of command and control tradition still, even though they're trying to transition. But if they're still firmly under trial and error, have their habits formed under that tradition, then changing that becomes really, really, really challenging. Building a new organisation from the bottom up in an agile way that's a different proposition.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments that anybody wants to make?
Someone said, I can see things happening, but I need more language to describe what's happening to others and to myself. Did you want to speak to that, or was that just a general, so I mean, a really interesting comment?
I can see things happening, Brandon. Yeah.
Language is really so important to all of this.
Yeah, we had this discussion last night, actually. Tresma and I had this discussion last night with the group that we're working with at the moment through our current organisational agility program. And, you know, if you think about this in terms of your own journeys with Agile, before you even heard of the word Agile, right, you didn't know anything about it. At some point in time in your life, you heard about the word Agile and about what Agile was. Then you started to build a career in Agile, so you started to learn all the language that is very unique and sits around or sits underneath the Agile framework. Right? So all of the terms that you know. That language is you know, how you become an Agile practitioner. You have to have that language in order to become a good Agile practitioner, right? Sounds obvious. When it comes to actually learning about behavioral flexibility, emotional flexibility, thinking flexibility, again, they're just words like Agile is. It's not until you actually begin to learn the language of those concepts, all right, of what it means as a human being to be flexible. It's not until you start to use the language of it that you can actually begin to even engage with it and practice it in any real way. It just becomes, otherwise it's all in your head, right? And again, as you know in your world, if Agile is just in the head and it's just a completely intellectual process, that's all it is. It's a series of processes and systems. It's not transformational because it isn't transformation. It's not transforming human behavior. So that's possibly why, you know, you are, and it's a really good insight. And I think a lot of people do struggle with this, that you can see these things that are happening. You have some sort of often, you know, visceral kind of response to them, and you don't really know why. You haven't got the words to label it, so it just ends up being this kind of frustration, or the sense of fear, or the sense of excitement, or whatever it is, but that's as far as you can go. So actually the work that Tresna and I are doing to a large degree is giving people the language to be able to understand what it actually means to become more agile as a human being, to become more adaptive as a human being, to step into situations that we might feel uncomfortable about stepping into. We need to have the language to be able to do that.
And what we find in our program is that people start to talk differently. So when they talk differently and they have the language and the frameworks, then it opens up, they can see the world differently and they start to engage. So they're all engaging with the world differently. So it is an unlocking and a rewiring that happens around moving language and positioning in a different way so that you can get those deeper insights. So thank you, Sarah.
I see we're just getting close to 7:15 there. Beth, is there anything from your point of view that you wanted to, or anyone else, just kind of wrapping up any protocols around how you wanted to wrap up the session for those that do need to depart at 7:15?
Well, again, just thank you, Tresna and Brett. That was amazing. So claps all around. Apologies again for the tech. Oh, we do have another question. So we'll do one more question, then we'll do a quick wrap up. So how to promote behavioral flexibility when there's a cultural conflict and personal values among teams and leaders?
Yeah, that's a big question. Where to start?
Yeah.
3
minutes. Go.
Solve that one. Okay, well, I'll tell you mine and Brett's perspective, you know, after all of our research, is that you can't if there's a culture of conflict and personal values and conflicting values, then you're going to have an absolute breakdown in emotional flexibility in the first place. And thinking flexibility for that matter, and they're all interconnected, right? So you can't promote behavioral flexibility because the culture supports or grows the emotional and the thinking flexibility. So you create those conditions. In that situation, the conditions need to be right, and the conditions come from the people who are facilitating and leading. Now, if those people don't understand how to facilitate and put the right conditions in place, then you're not going to get any of that happening. So that's a leadership issue. And those leaders probably don't have a framework for understanding how to work with that complexity. They don't know how to solve, I would say, in that environment, they don't understand how to solve complex problems and create the conditions that lend themselves to, you know, robust problem solving.
Can I just add to that? I mean, the reason it's a really good question, and if that answer, that response of Tresna seems blunt, it's quite deliberate. Because very often what happens is that, particularly in leadership roles or if external experts get brought in and a problem like that is put on the table, then there are lots of fear. Oh yes, we know how to fix this, and this will change that. We can do this, we can do that. And maybe, but very often it just needs this is a situation that needs a dramatic intervention that probably will involve people in that situation no longer being in that situation if you want to get sustainable long-term change. And if it sounds blunt, that's because it is, because often that's what's needed.
Yeah, it's too complex. Human behaviour is too complex to go, you know, there's no quick wins here. It has to be right. It has to be systemically and culturally right.
Yeah, and Guy mentioned.
Yeah, exactly.
To follow them. So
yeah, it's a good ending point, Guy. Nice one.
You're hired.
Yeah.
That'd be useful right now.
Yeah.
We just need your mind, don't worry.
We're a volunteer organization, just saying. But anyway, thank you all for joining.
Yeah,
again,
thanks, guys.
Brett and Tresna, and again, thanks for your patience with technology. There will be a recording. We will splice the two together, and we'll put it on our YouTube channel. We'll post it on the meetup. But yeah, if you have any questions, you can get onto our Slack channel, and I'm sure Tresna and Brett, you know, we'll put their email addresses up there. Is that okay, guys? Or am I?
Yeah, sure is. Yep, sure is. Definitely.
Yeah,
thank you for your comments and thank yous. I'm really glad that it resonated, and you know, if you're interested, touch base with us, and we're always open to chats.
Definitely. So next meetup is in July. I don't have the date in front of me. It's our AGM, so stay tuned for that. And thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Beth. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Beth.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
See ya. Bye-bye.